thoughts that you have, questions that you have. I think I'll.
Thank you so much, Michael. Siobhan?
I think. Thank you.
It's not working.
I think the.
It's not working.
All right. It's working now. Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here, and as Michael said, I'm really excited to learn from all of you. My name is Siobhan McDonough. As they mentioned, I'm with USAID as a portfolio manager with Development Innovation Ventures as part of the Innovation Technology and Research Hub. So how I got into this is my first job in college was actually living and working in Lusaka, Zambia as a research associate and also leading survey teams for household surveys. We talked to hundreds of farmers about programs that were happening in Southern Province in Zambia and whether they were working and whether the farmers were learning, connecting to markets in the way that they hoped to be and they needed to be. And I learned then the importance of programs working for people that they're supposed to be working for, and importantly, when they're not working, making sure that they're refined or stopped or replaced with something more effective. And I also met in Zambia a lot of entrepreneurs with great ideas, people who were close to the problems, who had great solutions for their communities, but who struggled to find financing for this. After that, I worked in Silicon Valley for a while, not in tech, but I was around a lot of tech. And also met a lot of great entrepreneurs there and saw the opportunities for financing for growing their startups that they had, that people in Lusaka who had equally incredible ideas did not always have. So at this conference, you've probably seen many of the financing opportunities that are going on. We're going to talk about some here. And USAID is not going to be all of the solutions, but we can be, and we are currently part of this. So currently in the world, there are a lot of problems. So wildfires and floods, growing food insecurity and forced migration, democratic backsliding, and for that we need new approaches and partnerships. The world is not going the same as it always has been, and so we can't be the same as we always have been. The Innovation Technology and Research Hub is part of the foresight of USAID, harnessing advancements in science, technology, and innovation for development. We believe that good solutions can come from anyone, anywhere, at any time, and we work to accelerate impact of these solutions. As the Innovation Division, we find and fund breakthrough ideas and employ evidence and flexible pay-for-performance funding approaches so that we can work with new partners, with people who may not have otherwise been able to receive funding from USAID, from smaller organizations, from local, from women-led organizations, as we'll talk about later, to address the most pressing challenges. And this is why I joined, and I love working for Development Innovation Ventures, because I think we see innovations from people all over the world. I know there are probably some entrepreneurs here and would love to hear from you. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Andrea and Zahra, and thank you all for welcoming us. I feel like I'm kind of in a home, welcoming place. I'll explain why in a little bit, but you asked me for the long background. You have 3 minutes. I'm gonna do all at 57 years in that 3 minutes. So I'm from Sudan. I was born in LA. My dad had come here, and I was talking to Michael in the White House. My dad came here to set up the Aboud presidential visit to John F. Kennedy. That's before I was born. Then there was a coup, and he left government. I was born when he was in grad school in LA. And we went back. Then, 5 years later, there's another coup. And so it very quickly deteriorated, and a lot of political pressure. My dad was the head of the university press at that time. So we ran back to California, and then he had a stroke a year later. So I was largely raised by my grandmother illiterate, very tribal, married when she was 6, had 2 daughters. One became a doctor and one had to go back to the village in Nubia, where we're from. Actually, we were displaced by yet another dictator in Egypt who built a dam and flooded our part. So sorry if there's any Egyptians, no slights against you. But the high dam destroyed Nubia. That's a long other story. So we went back to California, and I grew up with this sense of what is this Sudan that my grandmother is from, you know. While she was illiterate, she instilled in us a value of education. I went to Princeton, Woodrow Wilson School, no slight against Columbia. I went to SAIS, sorry, no slight, you know. It's all good, but I actually lived here. My wife was here in grad school. My goal out of college was to do something about that economic injustice. So I wanted to go into economic development, and I wanted to go to the World Bank Young Professional Program and work on Sudan. And so it took me 3 tries, and then meanwhile I was doing consulting, turnaround, and eventually got in. But then, by then, yet another coup had happened, and we had somebody named Omar al-Bashir, who had no interest in people like me coming and helping Sudan. And so it was decades, and I'm constantly being thwarted by political issues and bad governance in my attempts to do something that it was instilled in me from my upbringing. Eventually, so I was a decade in the World Bank, a decade in IFC. I did work on Sudan briefly. I went to Omidyar Network, where I started focusing on tech and ethical tech. But then there was a revolution. It's become a theme, as you probably guessed. A revolution, but this time an opening for democracy, and decided to go in the transitional government as an advisor. We worked on the reforms, debt restructuring, the currency, and I was working in the financial sector, the last piece of getting about $500 million for the country. And the guy in the parking lot said, "You probably shouldn't go in today because there was a coup. The generals have taken over again." I thought about it a lot, but I ultimately did stay home that day. And about a month later, I left, and we were sort of advocating, including, just telling you, in the White House, people at the NSC, and trying to do something about this and get democracy back on track. It has not happened, and in fact, the generals who took over are now fighting each other and have destroyed the country. You know, in this time since then, that was October 2021, I really thought about, why am I going around in circles? What happened to my dad happened to me. And I think in the long run, we're not going to have the kind of governments that Africans deserve unless there's a bigger middle class, and unless youth who are really the heart of agency and empowerment have the constraints lifted from them on having the impact that Africa needs. And to me, that my calling was not to go back to IFC or Omidyar or World Bank, but rather to start a venture capital firm and back those innovators and entrepreneurs who are really leading Africa forward. And so I started African Renaissance Ventures last year, and we're backing East African high-impact tech startups.
Thank you very much.
I'm not going to be long, 3 minutes right now, just 57 years, so.
It's okay, we're going on African time. So thank you all so much for your introduction. So I want to just jump right into our conversation. So when we were thinking about creating this panel, you all represent such diverse backgrounds and different types of financing. And so we always talk about capacity building in Africa. And I would argue that Africa doesn't have a capacity problem as a capital problem. And so I want to get into that with you all and really talk about not only how can we get more capital in the hands of governments, but capital in the hands of those who are doing the work. So young people, women, those on a day-to-day who are solving these problems on the continent, how can we get money in their hands and overcome the barriers that exist for them to receive this financing? So as Zara mentioned, there's a $400 billion development financing gap in Africa annually. So my question to you all, representing different financing priorities and backgrounds, how can blended finance models, including donor agencies, international development banks, private investors, how can that be improved to streamline and accelerate scaling for critical sectors that are historically unfunded, such as agriculture and healthcare? So I will start with Michael.
Yeah, thank you. You know, it's really interesting working in government, and I would imagine, I've seen it on the private sector too, that there is a lack of coordination. Sometimes the left hand is not speaking to the right hand. So when we're talking about how do we address these various issues, you have, whether it be large-scale initiatives, or whether it be kind of projects that are being built up. There are a lot of different sectors that are focusing on the same thing, but they're not talking enough to be able to work together and kind of push it across the finish line. I think streamlining communication, that kind of interagency coordination, and more so, and I think one of the things that you were getting at, and I'd like to touch on at some point, is the public-private partnership. Those types of relationships shouldn't be, there's a challenge and I have the answer, but really finding ways to figure out the different approaches that we have to some of these issues and working together to do it.
Thank you. Siobhan, same question.
Thank you so much for your question, and I think speaking to what Michael brought up about about making sure that people talk to each other, I think I could talk a little bit about development innovation ventures and what we're looking for in some of our grants, so what we do. So we're USAID's evidence-driven open innovation program, and we use a rigorous tiered evidence approach to fund breakthrough solutions to some of the world's toughest development challenges. And so we're an open innovation fund, which means we accept applications from entrepreneurs, from nonprofit organizations, anywhere in the world at any time to test promising ideas and build evidence of what works to improve outcomes, and also scale highly effective solutions to improve millions of lives. So I think what speaks to your question is particularly the question on scaling. So we fund innovations that scale through the public sector, through the private sector, and also sometimes through hybrid. And actually a lot of the innovations that we do fund are hybrid scaling innovations. So it's a nonprofit, for example, but then there's government partnerships. There's the social entrepreneur. It's a social entrepreneurship business, but also may receive some sort of public support. So something that we're looking for, I think, particularly at what we call our stage 2 grants, so that where we're finding evidence and preparing these for scale, is that an organization has the partnerships necessary to scale either with the public sector, with the national or regional or county governments, and that they're thinking through the scaling strategy, both in terms of their private sector, whether they're actually going to be making money, and then also through these partnerships.
Take a cut at that question. I would say, well, first of all, I believe in venture and risk-based financing, but I also, because of the position I'm in, know that the perception of risk in Africa is an obstacle to Africans getting funded. And so if I were to say a successful use, or something that should be done for large infrastructure, where it's very cost sensitive to the cost of capital, if you can somehow quantify the public good that gets delivered, that public good should be funded with public money, and then allow the private sector capital to flow to fill the gap once it's de-risked. But that doesn't really apply so well to venture. But I do think there is a lot of money that tries to go and help set up ecosystems, and I think some of it's misdirected. You end up getting a lot of entrepreneurs that chase grants rather than chase successful business models. What I'd rather see is the first investment by any new LP or angel investor or any new entry into an African vehicle somehow be de-risked. Because once people got into Africa, I believe they would stay and invest more. And I also think that's true for African capital. There's a lot of African capital that prefers to be here, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, rather than in Africa. So I think we need to figure out how to better de-risk new LP, limited partner, or new direct investment into African vehicles, funds, or direct, into startups. I would prefer to see that than the sort of somewhat less than entirely helpful. Not this one. At the very early stages, some grants do make sense, but you start to see companies that get to be fairly large and they have a cost structure because they've had so much grant money that is not sustainable in terms of scaling a business. The reason I say people would stay is because the investments that we're in are all doing very well, and yet nobody would expect that. If I tell you that one of them has gone from 14 million health records, they digitize health records, to 41 million in 4 months, or I tell you that a fintech in Uganda is scaling at 10 to 20% per month, I'd say those are good investments, right? And that's just in our first few investments, and then the next one I'm looking at is even faster in Tanzania. So the question is, how do you get people over that mental hurdle?
Thank you. And so, Matthew, just following up on your question, you speak about de-risking investments in Africa, and my mind goes immediately to crisis and conflict-affected regions on the continent. And so, you're from Sudan, and as we know right now, Sudan is in the midst of a terrible humanitarian crisis due to conflict in the country, with millions displaced inside and outside of Sudan, devastating rates of sexual violence and famine as well as being declared within the country. And so, given your experience with African Renaissance Ventures and also working with the transitional government of Sudan, how can venture capital, in your opinion, be strategically leveraged to mitigate risks associated with investing in conflict-affected regions, such as in the Horn of Africa? And furthermore, what approaches can be taken to ensure that this financing not only scales local entrepreneurship, but also actively contributes to peace building and long-term sustainable development in these volatile environments?
That's a tough question. I'll have to just take a couple quick bites at it, and maybe we can stay and we can talk a little bit more on later. One is that the first thing I said was when I decided that the best way for me to help long-term was to diversify the private sector. It's because in many of these very fragile states, you have private sectors that are captured by government. In very narrow private sector. You look at the Arab Spring, whether Ben Ali or Mubarak or many of the other governments, you had a private sector that had really built up around that power, and it could not deliver services, it wasn't responsive to people, it could not deliver the jobs, and then eventually had to be overthrown. But actually I saw that in Asia with the financial crisis. If you look at Korea and Thailand, very similar links between the private sector and government. And so for me, it is a crisis mitigation. Diversifying and building entrepreneurship that is disconnected is one preventative measure against the kind of fragility that I've seen time and time again. Secondly, I would say that going back, if we're to rebuild, looking at Sudan, technology has to be part of it, and entrepreneurs have to be part of it. The core industrial parts of Sudan have been destroyed. How are you going to you can't afford the inefficiency that was there before, so you need to use technology which lowers the cost and increases the speed and efficiency for delivering all kinds of public services. We're not going to rebuild all the schools and hospitals and clinics and old school, middlemen-driven distribution systems. We're going to need technology. But mobile is something that works even in fragile places because it can be modularized. Mobile money as opposed to building out banking systems. So the reason why asset light stuff can work is because it's frankly less risky we can get to revenue faster. So I do think it's appropriate for higher risk environments. But let's, also be realistic. I'm not investing in Sudan right now. Right? There are a few of the startups we were going to invest in are restarting in a small way. But I'm investing in Uganda and Tanzania and Rwanda. We need stability. So we do need governments to, we need to stop conflicts, and we need governments to be stable. We build out that private sector to be less fragile so we don't get into those situations in the first place.
Thank you, Mandy. Siobhan, the next question is to you. So you spoke about conflict just recently, and I know with USAID, it's more so focused on development financing. And so I wonder if you can speak to what it looks like in terms of innovations that you've seen that kind of exist at that development humanitarian nexus, and what that looks like in different parts of the continent that are more in protracted crisis types of areas. What do you see as innovations that are coming out of those spaces, and what does that funding look like?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think similar to what Magdi was talking about, I think most of our investment. So I guess I can explain a little bit more about DIV strategies. So we're an open innovation fund, which means that we accept applications from everywhere, but that also means that we can only fund areas where we can apply from. So we were talking right before the panel about, we fund a lot of people in India, a lot of people in Kenya, and people are often asking, why do you fund so many people in India and Kenya? Are those specific countries that you're focused on? And that's not true, but we get a lot of applications from India, we get a lot of applications from Kenya, and so we can only read the applications that we see. So I think to your question, from many conflict-affected areas, unfortunately, we're not getting many applications. So if you look at our portfolio and you see there's not a lot of funding in these areas, it's not because we don't want to fund or that we cannot fund them, but because we're just not getting as many applications from here. And that's one thing I also wanted to talk about here is that if you are an entrepreneur anywhere or building a nonprofit, then we can accept your applications.
Thank you, Siobhan. Everybody should be thinking about their idea to submit the DIV and speak to Siobhan afterwards. So Michael, my question to you is from U.S. foreign policy side. The U.S. has invested heavily in increasing trade and investments between the U.S. and African economies for initiatives like Prosper Africa and the African Growth and Opportunity Act. How are these policies being tailored to better support youth-led startups and entrepreneurial ecosystems in Africa, especially in sectors like technology and green energy? How are these initiatives contributing to a positive enabling environment for both the U.S. economy as well as in Africa, returns for Africa, not only financially, but as well as development and social benefits as well?
Well, thank you for that question, particularly as you talk about quantifying the quality piece. I think the first thing is the approach is youth-centered. So when you're thinking about the approach that we have, it is training, it is development. When we're working through these initiatives that you're talking about, all of them have similar and the same components. It's training, it's development, it's investment, and it's support not only of youth-led ventures, but also civil society organizations who allow the time the youth have leadership roles. I think in addition to that, it's kind of the focus from the USG or the US government on some of those things that you're talking about. Digital, expanding access to, I mean, we're not talking about minerals and other things like that. We're talking about digitization, technology, these areas that are more easily accessible to the youth dynamic group. And I think another thing is kind of the the breadth of diversity. I think when we're thinking about this, there's not only an acknowledgement in terms of our posture and our approach, the acknowledgement of the contributions, but a focus on, and I hope we get to talk about this later, the diaspora, and kind of what role that plays. So when you're talking about the approach, those are the three things that we're centering it. We're making sure that the areas that we're focused on and that we're investing in are areas that are open and be able to be expanded to a certain group, particularly the youth group. And the third piece is being able to take advantage of not only the youth, but the connections and the connectivity that the youth have in the diaspora.
Thank you for that answer. And so since you spoke about digital, you spoke about tech, I wanted to ask another question to Magdi about energy in Africa. And so given the pressing issue of energy insecurity in Africa, with over 600 million Africans without access to electricity, what role do you see for venture capital in funding innovative energy solutions that can enhance resilience in communities? And with the startups that you have, or those that you're looking at in your portfolio, beyond the financial returns, what metrics are you using in order to kind of assess their effectiveness in terms of socially their impact?
Thank you. That's a lot. You've done a lot of homework. That's hard. So yeah, we do consider ourselves an impact-focused fund, and so for every deal that we do, part of the terms are what metrics are we going to have you track in order to make sure that we're able to report to our investors that there is impact as well as returns. So, and I think you can't have impact unless you have returns. There's no sense in doing something really beautiful if it hits like, 1,000 people. It has to scale, and to scale, it has to have financial returns. So the first one we did was a company that recycles plastic waste into low carbon building materials, and which is used for low income housing, and it reduces plastic, reduces GHG, reduces the cost of housing. So we track those three things. Healthcare ones, we will do that. But then, you asked about renewables and how those venture helping. I think you have sun culture on one of the panels today, so he's probably the best one to answer. But so climate and climate tech is probably now the second or third biggest sector behind fintech in Africa right now, and it's a boom. It's not all 100% panning out, but if you go around Kigali today, you go to a gas station. There's also a battery swapping station for ampersand motorcycles, and then there's also a charging station from another one called EV Pay or something like that. So you've gone from fuel to two alternative sources of renewables. The big trend, I would say, in terms of renewable energy, particularly solar, is that it's no longer about sort of pay-as-you-go M-COPA style, mobile phone, get a solar panel, be able to charge your phone. It's linked to health, the rural clinics. It's linked to education. It's linked to housing. I was just having lunch today with somebody who's developing in South Africa developments that are all linked to centralized solar power, and then they're going to go into batteries, so that they all 24/7 power. So it's no longer about energy. It's renewable energy is also about healthcare. It's also about education. It's also about housing. It's also about mobility. And these motorcycle drivers are getting 40% reduction in costs. So it's also linked to jobs.
Thank you. My next question is for Siobhan. So, despite global commitments to gender equality, women still face significant barriers to accessing development financing. You had mentioned in your previous response about you're not seeing many applications from those in conflict-affected regions. And so that's a barrier for that financing to go towards people who are living in those areas. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to, specifically as it relates to women, how USAID is ensuring that its financing, especially through DIV, is reaching women-led entrepreneurs directly rather than being diluted by intermediaries. And what is USAID doing to make sure that women in Africa know that this funding is available, are applying because they do have ideas and they do have innovations, ventures that are underfunded, but they are doing this work. What is USAID doing for that? And what does it look like in terms of DID, women-led innovation ventures?
Great, thank you so much for that question. I think quickly before I answer that, I want to thank you for the shout out to Ampersand because DIV actually provided early catalytic financing for Ampersand. And I think that, thank you. I think that provides an example of, we don't want, as you were talking about, we don't want people to be grant dependent. So we provide catalytic funding so that they can scale through the public or private sector. So it's very exciting for me to be on Rwanda Air and then see a story about Ampersand and then go to Rwanda and see, as you said, Ampersand all around, since we aren't funding them anymore, but they've had great success. And I think that's a great example of how DIF funding can be catalytic as well as other financing. So to your question, USAID continues to prioritize gender equality and women's empowerment. We have a new policy from last year around advancing gender equality and empowerment and strengthening our operational and programmatic frameworks around that. A lot of that is actually through our GenDev Hub, which is not DIV, but who provides cross-sectoral expertise and technical assistance to teams across the agency, including DIV. So all of our projects go through a gender review. I work primarily in agriculture, and so our agriculture projects from the beginning are working to include female farmers, crops that are traditionally grown by female farmers, including women. One of the organizations we fund is Mediae/Shamba Shepa, very popular in Kenya, but we're funding its expansion into Uganda and making sure to include female local perspectives in every single episode of their shows, which are agricultural extension shows, training farmers in different techniques, including regenerative techniques. So the GenDev Hub also has the Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund. So this is outside of DIV, but they've reached more than 500,000 people since launching in 2021 and supported over 3,100 women-owned micro enterprises to access loans, bank accounts, and other services. I think to DIV specifically, we can and do support directly many women-led organizations. So we have fixed amount awards, which are milestone-based. We figure out the milestones with the grantees, and they also have less hefty reporting requirements than many USAID awards. So this allows smaller organizations that may not be able to get funding from other parts of the from the agency to work with DIV. One example of an award that we're doing particularly around women's empowerment is actually in India. So this is a new award. We have, I think, 30 awards that we're announcing soon. And it is a build-on of a study of India's rural workfare program, and a study a few years ago gave women were doing this work, but then were potentially losing their wages because they didn't have a bank account. And researchers, researchers worked with the government to both give women bank accounts, their wages were deposited directly into this, and then help train women to use this bank accounts. And then they found that women had more control over wages and empower vendors in the long term as well, because this was conducted in, I believe, 2013. And so our new project is now, because of this program is expanding, is testing new models of this version at scale with researchers with a plan to expand this with the partnership from the government, as you discussed. It's important that this doesn't happen in a vacuum if it's just researchers going out and doing research for research's sake, but they're partnering with the state government to try to find the best way to ensure that these women can have control over their wages.
Thank you so much. Last question before I open it up for audience Q&A. I wanted to end with this question to you, Michael. So as a Caribbean American myself, born in the US passport, US citizenship, parents immigrated to the US almost 30 years ago now. I know that is something that many of us in this room can relate to. And oftentimes we can feel like our own governments back home in Africa do not recognize us, and maybe equally as well that the US government doesn't as well. Does the US government know that, the African diaspora, is a unique dynamic population to engage and to elevate, and how so? And so my question to you is, how does the growing African diaspora in the US factor into US foreign policy engagement with African countries? And since you're from the Office of Public Engagement, maybe what does that work look like in your own role? And just what do you see as, how can we leverage the diaspora skills, their investment potential, their cultural influence to foster stronger bilateral ties?
Thank you for the question. Before I go into it, I have a question for the group. How many of you, raise your hand if you identify as a part of the African diaspora? So look around. So when we're talking about, I'll raise my hand as well. When we're talking about building Africa's future, and kind of what we're doing here at this conference, it's the folks that are around us. And I think a lot of the time we're talking about future and youth and one day, this year, but it's the power of now, and having these conversations now, and kind of doing the work now. So that's one thing that I just kind of wanted to point out. But in terms of the work, this has been one of, if not the biggest kind of acknowledgments and approach that the U.S. government has taken is a focus on the diaspora. And I can backtrack it a second to say that when this administration really looked at how do we approach policy and representation across the board in the White House and across the agencies, it was looked at through a lens of equity and diversity, which has and continues to be our strength. A step forward when we're talking about the diaspora and kind of what has that engagement looked like, the president created and put together the Advisory Council on Diaspora Engagement, housed at the State Department, where they're doing a lot of great work. And he did that because he understood that the U.S. is uniquely qualified and positioned to be able to work with, take advantage of, coordinate with, have conversations with, and approach the African diaspora specifically. And that's why that council was put together, and I was a part of standing that up. I think beyond that, too, I think the second part of your question, it is more than just kind of acknowledging how important the diaspora is, even if it's at the highest levels. And it's like, what does that approach look like? And I think that approach comes in a few forms. One of it is the understanding. So you talked about your background, but when we're talking about how do we approach the diaspora, and I tell people all this time, when we talk about Africa, Africa is diverse. Africa is 54 country. Africa, this is not U.S. Africa. This is U.S. Angola, it's U.S. South Africa, it's U.S. Benin, it's U.S. Cameroon. So it's really understanding and being open to understanding the complexities and the diversity when we're talking about not only these bilateral relationships, but working within the diaspora. So that's one. And I think a big portion of it also is promoting it. Not only have we done that through the establishment of the council and the work that the council has done, which I'll touch on in a second, but also in our policy making in terms of promoting African representation in G20 and the UN Security Council and others. That's work that this administration and government has continued to do. And it's engaging. So many of you may have seen the Vice President's trip to various countries on the continent, the First Lady's trip to various places on the continent, the Second Gentleman's, but there were more than 20 U.S. cabinet officials and senior high-level officials over this past year and a half, 2 years, that have went to visit and engage and understand and meet people where they are. And I think the last piece touches on the innovation of it and kind of innovating in that space. So the President's Diaspora Council is not for show. There have been partnerships set up. Not only have they traveled to places in Nigeria and Ghana and others as a council to meet with the cross sectors on the ground, but also putting together partnerships, one of them being the EdTech initiative that focuses on connecting HBCUs and universities in different African countries for STEM. So it's the work that comes behind it.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you all so much for engaging with all my questions. I know that you've done very difficult, but thank you for giving us the pleasure of just hearing your thoughtful insights, learning about your careers and the work that you are doing every single day in Africa and how your work connects. So I invite you all to just give a round of applause to all of our And so we're going to open it up for Q&A. We have mics in the room. Okay, and so we're gonna ask some questions. We ask that you please keep the questions brief, as well as the responses, so we can get to as many as we can with the time that's remaining.
Hi, so my name is Baku. Yeah, thanks. You guys shared some insightful information. So I'm kind of in the features like Africa's being developed, especially in Ghana and other countries. There's kind of been this thing like for a lot of there's a lot of expats in Africa now, and so a lot of locals are, prices are going up, and it's actually like I have some friends who live in different African countries who say that like things are getting very expensive, and it's hard for actually like people like Native Africans to have access to a lot of new developments, like places to live, and just like keeping up with the cost of living. And I wanted to know like how you feel like going forward, maybe like we could keep kind of fight that and keep prices from going up for Native Africans, and making sure like their quality of life isn't really being affected by inflation. I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you very much. Does anybody want to take that? Maybe Maggie?
In the interest of time, would it be good to
You
take
want
a
to take a
group?
couple of them?
Yeah, I think it'd be good.
No problem. And so Mike's yes in the back?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Awesome. This question's mostly specifically for MACD, but it's open to the entire panel. Bear with me as I lay something out really quickly. I'm an EMBA graduate here, from the EMBA program last year, and I am going into the JD program next year, Columbia Law School. I had an exchange with John Paul Adam, who's the UN special advisor that was sent here to speak yesterday in place of the other special advisor for some reason. And he answered a number of questions, and he shared a number of different things. But there was a very specific question I put to him that was more from a legal perspective about why some of these African countries don't just default. Specifically, some of the countries that have some of these resource allocation problems that essentially from a realistic perspective mean they're already in default, and what effect that has on the actual people on the ground, and what that has to do with resource allocation by the US and Africa. So Maggie, really this question is kind of put to you because it sounds like you have the expertise, but as I said, it's for the whole panel. We know that the real answer that he was giving yesterday was some of these leaders have a lot of personal wealth and they don't want to give it. But what he did talk about was some of the Bretton Woods principles that exist that would make it possible, as Greece did in the financial crisis, to default and get access to first, second, double trigger laws and municipal laws that would keep those countries running. In fact, most probably the debt would be wiped out. So beyond the fact that these African leaders want to preserve their personal wealth, which we understand, everybody has their own incentive system, what actual solution, what emotional architecture solution exists to reconcile this real solution to real problems with some of the needs of these leaders?
Yes, question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the insightful discussion. I'm a first semester sustainability management student. My question centers around, so as investors continue to prioritize sustainable returns, reporting metrics are becoming more sophisticated and continually evolving, especially as the science continues to progress. What qualitative data points are you prioritizing, and how are you conveying that value creation to investors, especially as it relates to social equity and biodiversity?
Thank you. And we'll take one more question here, up front.
Hello, my name is Juliana. I have a question around private-public partnerships because I think this is the second time I'm hearing about it, and I'm wondering if we're considering that an innovation. But also, if you think about, I'm from Kenya, and if you think about, I think this morning we talked about 3 cents of the dollar in petrol costs being because of a public-private partnership. But if you add those costs, so actually 40% of petroleum costs that are in taxes and levies. So in the public financing side of things, a lot of those costs are put forward or paid for by taxes levied on Africans. And that drives up some of the costs of energy, some of the costs of petroleum, etc. And I think there's also the inefficiencies that are built in within government. So Magdi talks about private sector capture. So I'm wondering, at what point should we be prioritizing improving transparency, accountability, and efficiency within the public sector before really prioritizing this public-private partnership? Because I think that lack of stewardship around proper financial accountability in the public sector is meaning that we're not getting any benefits of some of those huge infrastructure programs. For example, this morning, an irrigation program in Kenya was mentioned that it was supposed to have been completed in 2019, and there has been no yields whatsoever. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for your questions. So I'll turn it over to our panelists to respond. We'll just go one by one. Please feel free to answer the questions that you'd like for people to answer, the ones that speak most to you. I'll turn it over to Siobhan first. Basically, thank you.
Thank you so much for your questions. I think I'll answer your question on sustainable. Keep on losing my mic. On sustainable returns, reporting metrics, and measuring impact in different ways. So I think Development Innovation Ventures was started by an economist, and so we focus a lot on quantitative metrics, particularly for some of our higher amount awards, randomized control trials, comparing a group that got an award, that got a program to the group that didn't get a program, and are randomly selected. That said, I think qualitative metrics are also really important, and I think particularly our tiered funding model requires different levels of evidence. So a program that's just starting out, a very new nonprofit, is not going to be ready to start randomizing, nor if it's a market-based approach, may it need to randomize. And so for this, qualitative data points such as around social equity, around biodiversity are really important, and even within RCTs, back when I was conducting them and now when I'm funding them, I'm often looking also at qualitative metrics as well, because you might find that there's no effect quantitatively, or you might find there's a big effect quantitatively, but then is it having negative effects on other people? Do you know what's driving that? And for that, qualitative data is super important as a complement to quantitative data. I think for biodiversity, that's actually an area that we fund in. So one example of this was we funded an organization called Rainforest Connection, which was using sensors to prevent illegal logging. And that was a pretty successful project, and that's definitely an area. These areas are all areas in which we do accept applications and are thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. I'll turn it over to Magdi next, please.
Okay. You guys are tough too. I mean, I thought the moderators were tough, but my goodness. I'll try to take on a little bit on the debt restructuring default question, and maybe just a few words on this public-private question. So on the debt, look, we worked on the debt restructuring. We actually got it. We had a Paris Club deal that restructured $70 billion, most of the debt from the Bashir era, despite the fact that Sudan had oil, but it had corruption, and it had bad governance and money spent on military, and so it racked up a lot of debt. And in order to get that debt restructuring, we floated the currency. We removed all fuel subsidies. Fuel was basically 6 cents, and it went to market prices. So you're talking about thousands and thousands of percentage increases on the people. We did other things that would raise the cost of goods for people, some import tariffs, a lot of other things. All of that was done without any financial support because Sudan had been cut off. Then when we got the deal, the generals came in and took over again. So the people paid for that out of their pocket, only never to get the benefit from it. And so that's a deeply painful part of my experience, because I was in the middle of all those reforms, arguing for those reforms. The point is that you have to, if you want to get a HIPC debt deal done, or you go to the Paris Club on the sovereign debt, you go to the London Club on the commercial debt. So all these deals basically mean you have to conform to the standards that are being set, and we had relatively little to say about it. We negotiated the package, but the package, and I was Bretton Woods institution for 2 decades, so I believe in markets. But I also saw what it felt like to be on the other side, having fairly little room for maneuver and a lot of pain in order to get the debt removed. I don't think the stolen assets had a lot to do with it. Basically, Bashir took the money. It was found in his house, but more of it is in other places. I don't know if it's coming back, but it had nothing to do with the debt restructuring. We had to do what we had to do. It had to do with the problem, the fiscal gap and the debt gap, yeah, but the solution didn't rest on us finding that money again. So I don't link the two. I do say that the incentive for countries, if you want to access international markets, and donors are substantial, but the international markets are much, much bigger. They're donor funding and public funding, ODA, is infinitesimal compared to private markets. If you want to access those markets, you have to give those markets confidence. That's just part of the deal. And so you have to have a certain level of governance and standards, and if you default, you're going to pay a penalty, and that's all clearly understandable. Just a few points on PPP. I said I believe in markets, but markets only work when there's competition. When you have state-led governments that are limiting competition, it's almost better not to be private, get private players involved, because they're just going to create monopolies. I believe the subsidies work when you maximize what you can get from markets and then extend service delivery the last mile or where the markets aren't going to go with public money. So if you don't get that right, and in PPPs, the only chance you have sometimes for competition is when you're issuing the deal or the tender, the concession, or opening that market. If you miss that, it's very hard to come back, because you set in place inefficiencies, whether it's public or private.
And Michael, I'll turn to you last words on the public-private partnerships question.
Sure, I want to say something, but I'll ask just briefly about public-private partnerships. You have mentioned, is it an innovation? And I wouldn't necessarily say it's an innovation, but I think a necessity.
Is the mic working?
I hope so.
Yeah, I think so.
It is?
Can you all hear me? Okay. I wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily, I wouldn't say it's an innovation, but a necessity. I think that when we're looking at challenges that a whole community or society is facing, or opportunities to be able to develop, not one side has the full answer. So to me, and the approach that I've seen that's been successful is a healthy relationship balance and communication between the two sides. And it's tough. It's tough, particularly when you're getting into, when you have kind of unprecedented challenges and events like the pandemic that we've seen that are coming out of nowhere, but it's also tough when you're trying to push forward innovative solutions and to try to solve problems at a quicker pace, like these conversations that we're having around technology and AI. But I think that partnership has to continue, and I think it's a necessity to be able to do that. The last thing I wanted to say is, we talk a lot about kind of, there are questions about kind of, what is the solution here, or what are the thoughts here? But from our perspective, the USG is squarely focused on investing in what is really in this room, which is folks that represent the youth in the diaspora and innovative and creative ideas. So like, you have the answers that we're looking for. So I think it's really about that engagement piece. It's about having that conversation to be able to work, at least from my side, with the government. Like, we're looking for you, and that's why we're here, to be able to understand how to better work with you, whether it be ideas, whether it be thoughts, whether it be bringing together convenings where you are, and amplifying some of the work that you're doing. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there in closing, that like, these are the rooms that we want to be in. We do not have all the answers. We have a lot of work that we should be doing, could be doing more of. But a big part of that, I think, is really putting the focus there, and that's where our focus is.
May I just amplify that, because I really appreciate what you have done, the U.S. Africa Business Conference. But just from my own experience, every one of the founders, with one exception that we backed, is an African who's gone into the diaspora and then has come back and started the company. The only exception is that somebody's Dutch expat who's a co-founder to somebody who's an African, who's diaspora African. That diaspora works 100%.
Thank you all so much. Let's give a round of applause for
All right, thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Ooh.